The Church of St. George in the East is quite simply stunning. It was built between 1714 and 1729 to the design of Nicholas Hawksmoor, and the tower is such a striking local landmark that Nicholas Pevsner, in his East End edition of his Guide to the Buildings of England, was moved to describe it as the most original of Hawksmoor's East End churches. Its churchyard provides a lovely, quiet retreat from the ceaseless roar of the highway which passes to the south of the church. East Enders have been taking the air at this halcyon spot since the late 19th century. Indeed, the churchyard holds the distinction of being one of the first London burial grounds to be transformed into a public park, and it was opened as a municipal garden in January 1877. But the tranquil little garden also holds a dark, some might even go so far as to say macabre, secret. For, squatting close to the asphalt path that meanders its way through the churchyard, you will find a tumble-down brick shed. The roof of this curious little building has long since fallen in, and skeletal rafters poke skywards from the remains of it. Ominous black shutters have been affixed to its crumbling outer walls in order to keep the public out. Nothing, though, can keep nature at bay, and weeds and saplings sprout from what passes for a roof, whilst, even on a bright summer's day, a feeling of chilly melancholy seems to permeate the air around the ruin. It is safe to say that few of those who sit in or stroll through the garden bother to pay the tottering ruin any real attention. I would hazard a guess that none of them, well, right, maybe a few of them, are aware of the building's association with the Whitechapel murders of 1888 to 1891. And who could blame them, for there is nothing here to suggest that there is any connection between this strange little hut and the notorious Victorian crime spree. Even the adjacent information board, which provides for those who are curious enough to read it a brief synopsis of the building's history, is mute about its Jack the Ripper connection, simply stating that it was originally a mortuary that was converted to a nature study museum in 1904 and opened to the public as a branch of the Whitechapel Museum. It was during its period as a mortuary that it acquired its connection with the Whitechapel murders. For this was the mortuary to which the bodies of two of the victims, those of Elizabeth Stride and the Pinchin Street torso, were brought in the immediate aftermath of their deaths. And as such, it is one of only a handful of buildings to have survived in the district that have a direct connection with the case. One of the observations made at the inquest into the deaths of several of the victims, and in many other inquests of the era for that matter, was that Whitechapel lacked any proper mortuary facilities for the storage of bodies and the carrying out of post-mortems when the need arose. At the inquest into the death of Mary Nichols, the coroner, Wyn Edwin Baxter, commenced his summing up by commenting strongly on the absence of a public mortuary in Whitechapel where it was so greatly required. The jury agreed with him, and having returned their verdict, they added a rider expressing the full concurrence of the jury with the coroner's remarks as to the need of a mortuary for Whitechapel. However, the debate over adequate mortuary facilities in the district was not a new one. Indeed, the issue had been discussed by the parish vestry of St. George in the East as far back as July 1867. At the meeting, the medical officer raised the issue that over the last quarter, 3 bodies had been left in the houses in which they had died for what he considered to be an unreasonable amount of time, in one case the body remaining in the house for as long as 21 days, and it could not be removed because, as he pointed out, there was no place to remove it to. There was a case only the other day, he said, where a body was left lying in a room that was occupied by 7 people, and it remained there until it became a perfect nuisance to the place. The vestry referred the matter to the Committee of Works, but there was a general feeling that a mortuary was necessary for the district. Although no exact year of construction can be ascertained for the building that now survives, it would appear that it had been erected in the churchyard by 1869, in which year the conditions inside it were severely criticised by a doctor who had performed a post-mortem there on the body of a murder victim. The East London Observer reported on his comments in its edition of Saturday the 17th of April, 1869. Mr. Budgett, the surgeon, who was called to give the results of a post-mortem examination of the body, made some extraordinary statements. He said that, in the interests of justice, he desired to state that he could not make a proper scientific examination of the body with the appliances placed at his command. He had had to make the examination in a small house at the end of St. George's Churchyard. In that house there was no table, no light, no chair, no towel. To let in the light, he had to open the door and bring the body of the deceased to it. He had to place the body on a bench made of coffins, and then, placing the deceased on a coffin lid, he was able to make an examination of his body. In order to proceed with his examination, he felt obliged to take his coat off, and whilst he was busy, a crowd of people collected in the churchyard and looked at him and at the dead man's body. When he had taken the stomach out of the body, he found it was necessary for him to carry it into the churchyard in order that he might examine it sufficiently. The workhouse people thought it quite sufficient to send him an old pauper to carry water for him, and the water he had was carried in a bucket. There was no soap in the house, but the old pauper was able to produce a piece for a consideration. The witness thought it was his duty in the interests of justice that he should make this statement. Evidently stung by this public criticism, the parish vestry discussed the case at its meeting held on the 16th of April 1869 and concluded that the doctor was unjustified in his comments. Since the murder of Elizabeth Stride on the 30th of September 1888 took place in Berners Street, just a few streets north of the churchyard, this was the nearest mortuary to the scene of the crime, and so her body was brought here. Looking at the structure today, you sense that it really must have been cramped inside, and the task of carrying out the post-mortem on the body cannot have been a pleasant one for Dr. George Bagster Phillips, who performed it. Some idea of how onerous the task must have been can be gleaned from this illustration, which appeared in the penny illustrated paper on the 6th of October 1888. It must have been even more claustrophobic inside when, on the opening day of the inquest into Elizabeth Stride's death, the coroner and the jury trooped round to the mortuary to file in and view the body. The following report, which appeared in the Christchurch Times on Saturday the 6th of October 1888, captured the gruesomeness of the scene that they encountered. Mr. Wynne E. Baxter, the coroner for the district, opened an inquest at the Vestry Hall, Cable Street, St. George's in the East, on the body of the unfortunate woman mysteriously murdered in a yard at the rear of a club in Berners Street, Commercial Road. The jury, having been sworn, proceeded to view the body, which lay in the mortuary adjoining the Vestry Hall, and the coroner held a consultation with Dr. Phillips and other medical men engaged in the case. After looking upon the horrible spectacle of the dead woman, still fully dressed in the clothes she wore, with a throat cut and blood-stained face, the jury returned to the Vestry Hall, where some evidence was then taken. Various witnesses also came to the mortuary in order to view the body, as efforts were made to identify the victim in the immediate aftermath of her murder. Amongst them was Mary Malcolm, who claimed, falsely as it transpired, that the victim was her sister, Elizabeth Watts. It was also reported by some newspapers that a large number of prostitutes were allowed to visit the mortuary with a view to identification. However, as the Dundee Courier reported, several of them professed to recognise the deceased, but they were unable to state her name and address. One other witness who turned up at the mortuary was Matthew Packer, the fruit seller from Berners Street, who claimed that shortly before the time of the murder, he had sold grapes to a man who was accompanied by a woman who resembled the description of the victim. The Eastern Daily Press published a report on his visit, and what's interesting about the report is that it makes it clear just how rigorous the process was for admission to view the body. Matthew Packer, the owner of the little fruit shop in Berners Street, visited the mortuary accompanied by two private detectives for the purpose of seeing whether he could identify the body of Lizzie Stride as that of the woman for whom the grapes were purchased on the night of the murder. At the entrance to the mortuary, the official in charge subjected Packer to a severe cross-examination in reference to his knowledge in the matter. He described correctly the clothes the woman wore and was led inside, where he had no difficulty identifying the body as that of the woman for whom the grapes were bought. 11 months later, in September 1889, the headless torso of an unidentified woman was found beneath a railway arch in Pinchin Street, a few streets south of the Elizabeth Stride murder site in Berners Street. As had happened with Liz Stride, the remains were taken to the St George Mortuary, where crowds once again gathered to try to gain admission and view the torso. The Aberdeen Press and Journal reported on the scene around the mortuary in its edition of Wednesday, the 11th of September, 1889. The body of the deceased was removed to St George's Mortuary, and a large crowd gathered there directly, remaining throughout the whole day. Many unfortunates called to see the trunk, but none could identify it. In 1904, the building was converted for use as a nature study museum in what, as the information board outside puts it, was a pioneering effort in an overcrowded inner city area to give local people the opportunity to have more contact with nature. You can still make out the sign for the museum above the former entrance. You can't help thinking as you look at the tiny structure how even more crowded it must have been as a museum than it was as a mortuary, especially when you consider that, according to the information board, during the summer months up to 1,000 people a day reputedly visited the museum, mostly groups of local school children. The exhibits included tanks of live fish and amphibians, stuffed birds and mammals, and displays of butterflies. The question that immediately springs to mind is, where on earth did they put it all? The Nature Study Museum was closed during the Second World War, and although this was only meant to be a temporary measure, it never reopened, and the disused building gradually fell into disrepair. Although plans for a restoration and a reopening have been mooted from time to time, none of them have come to fruition, and the building becomes more and more ruinous with every year that passes. The day may well come when the decision is taken to demolish it altogether, and should that come to pass, then yet another location with a direct connection to the Jack the Ripper murders will become nothing more than a distant memory. But for now at least we can relax in this lush and tranquil garden whilst pondering the dark and sinister past of this curious little ruin, as we crane our necks skyward to admire the soaring splendour of the striking white-walled church of St George in the east that towers over it. And long may it continue to do so.